Welcome to the You Can't Perform What You Don't Know Industrial Stormwater Management Overview Workshop. Welcome back to Stormwater Awareness Week for Day 5. Brad Flack is your presenter today from StormwaterONE. Brad, if you'd like to introduce yourself, we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, I'm glad everyone's here. It's Friday, so celebrating that. Just want to put out some thoughts and prayers for those of you that are in the northwest part of Florida there with Helene going through. So I know that's tough for some of y'all that may be in that area. So yeah, I'm with StormwaterONE. I'm the subject matter expert and lead instructor. I came from 20 years of doing stormwater management from construction sites, permanent features like detention ponds, lift stations, hydrodynamic separators, etc. And about 12 years ago, I started with the industrial stuff. And when the industrial permit popped up in California, I was a co-author of an article that came out with another gentleman. He's based in California and he handles a lot of the mapping and monitoring software that is being done over there. So I've been around this for a long time. Even though I'm in my 21st year, even though I've been around for a long time, I don't know everything there is to know about everything. I'm not going to be that guy. All right. So if you ask questions along the way, and I don't have an answer. So that's a great question. Let me write that down and maybe I can get back with you, give me your email or something. But in the meantime, I do have a QR code. It'll be on each page. And we do have I've been working on it the end of last year, early this year, and it came out this summer, the Qualified Industrial Stormwater Manager. And it literally just goes section by section, training you through the EPA multi-sector general permit, also referred to as the Industrial Stormwater Permit. We've got, for you that are part of the Stormwater Awareness Week, we got a 15% off. That'll be available for the next week. So if you want to go ahead and get that locked in, we'd love for you to do that. If not, there's no obligation. This is all the Stormwater Awareness Week is free. So we're totally great with being a part of that. The EPA calls this the multi-sector general permit. And I know there's like California and some other places are calling it the industrial stormwater permit. It's not based on new construction, is what a lot of us have dealt with for years. It's based on, this site may have been around for 50 or 100 years. It's based on the activities that you're doing on the site. And we'll get into some of that in just a few moments here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background of how we got here and into some history there. And then we're going to go into some of the kind of major SWIP requirements of the industrial stormwater permit. I'm going to use multi-sector MSGP industrial, and I'm going to interchange those throughout this whole presentation. Um, and then I'm going to give you an overview of some of those SWIP requirements there. And then we'll go through the permit scope itself, and then some B&P maintenance and operations that are required for you to think through and perform on your site, depending on your site's conditions. And again, that's the whole kicker for this whole thing, is your site's conditions and potential pollutants. And then I'll mention some of the record keeping stuff. Kichi, you're asking a question about certification. This particular is just an overview. If you want to get the qualification that we have, you can go to stormwaterone.com and sign up for our qualified industrial stormwater manager. This is just an introduction. Our whole course is self-directed. You click through and answer questions and watch the videos and read the text. And you'll get that after you take that course. This is just an overview here, part of Stormwater Awareness Week, to make you guys aware of what industrial stormwater permitting looks like. So thanks for asking the question. Feel free to interact with me I got my chat pulled up here. So if you've got questions throughout, I'd love to answer those if I can. Again, if I can't answer, I'm saying, you know what, that's a good question. Let me get back with that person later. If I can, if that's something that you feel that's beneficial to you. We are a licensed occupational trade school in the state of Connecticut, and we do mainly online, but we also do in person from coast to coast and border to border. So if you need training or some additional help with anything, we can work through that as well. So where do we come from? Well, let's go back to 80 years ago to World War II. Okay, so World War II, we're sending people, personnel, materials, equipment, ammunition, whatever, across the face of the planet to win the war effort, right? And in the process of doing that, you kind of have your blinders on. You're like, we'll clean up the mess later. Let's go, 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 go. Well, as people are coming back from World War II, they're ready to start businesses, start families, whatever. And yeah, that's how you begin the beginning of the really suburban sprawls around the urbanized areas begins in the late 40s and 50s. And then you get into 1947, someone raises the flag and says, man, my old fishing hole over there is not nearly as clean as it was before I went off to war. What's going on? And I realized that some of the byproducts, waste, effluents, discharges, whatever, were just being kind of dumped into holes in the ground or even into waterways just to get it out of sight. And so in 1948, Congress passed the first of its kind legislation, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And that was good. The bad news about it was I would have to find, hey, Arnold, I witnessed you dumping, I don't know, vinyl chloride, 5 gallons of vinyl chloride into this exact spot on this exact stream. Now, that's very difficult to actually have that sort of level of detail, especially if I'm driving by on a bridge or something and I say, oh, there's somebody over there, they're dumping something, right? So it was very difficult to actually enforce that. And then we get into the 1950s, we're in an economic boom. It's Leave It to Beaver era. Everything's going well, right? And so 1960s, the baby boomers come of age, and I don't know everyone's ages here. I love all different generations, but the baby boomers, when they come of age in the 60s, they're a rowdy bunch, and they're out to deal with things. They're out to deal with civil rights and gender issues and racial issues and environmental issues. They're in another conflict. They're in Vietnam, 1965. 1968 is the high water mark for loss of life, injury in Vietnam, terrible year. And then 1969, the Cuyahoga River, which flows north through Cleveland into Lake Erie, catches on fire. And Lake Erie had, by that point, become a cesspool, and all the aquatic life had basically been killed off. So they said, all right, time out. We got to address this stuff. And so go back to the drawing board, take the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. Let's revamp it, revise it, edit it, get it up to date. And then in 1972, Congress issued the updated act under a new name called the Clean Water Act of 1972. And so that's really what we're kind of working under for all these years. 72 to 77, those first 5 years, they were going after what we call point source dischargers. And that was where they could say, hey, that factory is discharging benzene out of this pipe into this waterway, right? I can point to the source. That's a point source discharger. And they really got those under control. And that's why it is big news today. It's a 24-hour news cycle. It's going to be on there all the time. If somebody has a chemical release or somebody has a spill or whatever, a train derails or whatever the case is. So that is why that's big news. Back then, that was what happened. It was, stuff was just, oh, you just get rid of it. It'll flow down river. Not my problem anymore. Okay. But then in 1977, they thought, man, why does the water still have issues? It's still polluted. Where is this stuff coming from? So 1977 to 1982, the next 5-year window, they do the Nationwide Urban Runoff Program studies, the NURP studies, and the report comes out in 1983. And they figure out what you and I already know, and that's that people are disgusting animals, right? So, you're driving down the highway, you see that Walmart plastic bag floating across the lanes of traffic, and you know that it didn't come out of the Walmart bag tree. And you're driving down the county road, and you see the Starbucks cup or the Coca-Cola bottle or whatever, and you know that it didn't come off of some plant or bush. You know it's pollution, but unless I witnessed it exactly where it's originated from, I don't know. And that's what we call non-point source pollution. It's pollution, but I don't know exactly where it came from. So they figured out we've got to start addressing that stuff. By 1987, they issued the first of the stormwater quality amendments to the Clean Water Act. And the first one was dealing with construction sites. And those were 20 acres and larger. So you can imagine today a 19-acre construction site with no BMPs anywhere on the entire site. That would be still a huge mess, but you have to start someplace, right? So 1991, they issue a phase 1 MS4 permit. MS4 is municipal separate storm sewer system, and that's the counties, cities, Department of Transportation, these large groups that have a large watershed that they're responsible for, typically around urbanized areas. and it was for 100,000 people or more. So these larger ones, we're talking New York, Chicago, Miami, Houston, LA, et cetera. And then we get into 1995, and they issue the multi-sector general permit for the first time in 1995. And what we see there is they're now addressing, okay, we have all these factories and facilities and distribution centers and all these places where we have all these wide array of potential pollutants that are out there that may be exposed to rain or snow melt or whatever that could enter into the waterway. We've really got to get these folks to start managing their own sites. And that came out in 95. And so that's kind of where we got to today. We have the multi-sector general permit or the industrial stormwater permit. You'll have me say it both ways today. So as we're looking at this, what we have to remember is it's not based on how new it is. It's based on all of its activity across the site. So we'll talk about that a little bit. When you're looking from the federal level, right? We'll zoom out to the federal level. Each state may have its own multi-sector general permit, whatever. But from the federal level, the latest one came out in 2021, and it lasts until 2026. That's a 5-year window, right? I look at them as like umbrellas. I get this coverage. So your site, let's pretend that Heather's widgets are just blowing up and going crazy. Well, Heather's going to begin the process of manufacturing widgets, and that's what that little blue line is. Unlike construction would say, hey, we're going to build, this neighborhood, and then that construction is going to end. Unlike that, Heather's widgets, as long as she's in business making money and making widgets, she has to have that protection from whenever she starts her business until she's done or she's no longer the owner or the business ends. So it's ongoing coverage here. And so you can see this blue line across here, it continues on with the arrow at the end with math telling us that means ad infinitum, right? Now, here's the catch. Currently, Heather's widgets would be underneath this umbrella of the 2021 to 2026 industrial permit. But if you'll notice, that umbrella has an end point right there. And so what we have to remember is that when that permit ends, that umbrella closes. And so everybody who wants continued coverage underneath the next umbrella, which is 2026, 2031, they will have to apply for a renewal notice of intent to get covered underneath the new umbrella. With the idea is you are going to follow and keep up with and update your site and its BMPs to match whatever the new requirements are of that new umbrella. So every 5 years at a minimum, no matter when you start, right, you're going to finish with everybody else at that end of that 5-year period. Everybody ends on the same date and everybody starts the next date. Now there is a renewal timeline. Some states it's as low as 90 days after that new umbrella opens. You got to have your site moved underneath that umbrella. The EPA is 180 days. You get 6 months to do that. So it's not like some emergency situation, but you will forget about it if you don't pay attention. So make sure that you keep up with that 5-year cycle, and you should get a notification from the EPA or your state if you are covered underneath there. So each consecutive 5-year umbrella, you'll have to apply underneath that next umbrella as it pops up, so on and so forth. All right. Now, I've mentioned these kind of 3 permits, those stormwater quality amendments, and I'm going to show you kind of there's an interplay here between these so that you have a better understanding of how this is playing out. So let's say Heather's widgets, right? She's got this manufacturing facility. Let's say that she owns 20 acres, but she's only got 5 acres of manufacturing right now, right? But people are loving the widgets. So in order to capitalize on the success of Heather's widgets, Heather says, you know what? We're going to turn of my 15 remaining acres on my site, I'm going to make 5 more acres production facility. So she will continue manufacturing widgets, bringing in revenue, and then she will spend some of that money to expand her facility. And at that point, she would file for a construction general permit coverage for the new construction that's going on. Whenever that new 5 acres is complete, she will terminate the construction coverage and she will amend her multi-sector general permit to just state, hey, it's no longer 5 acres of manufacturing, it's 10 acres of manufacturing. And then she'll continue working on, again, every 5 years having to do the renewal. But that's how the multi-sector general permit is operating. Now, there is the MS4 permit as well. The MS4 permit in 2010, 11, 12, depending on where you were across the US, the phase 2 MS4 permits kicked into place. And that was for people that were 10,000 people and more. And so that's where you start getting these smaller towns and cities and counties, departments of transportation, even sometimes the Army Corps of Engineers gets kicked into it, depending on, the jurisdiction where they're working. So those people are required, those groups, I should say, not people, those groups, organizations are required at a minimum to have six minimum control measures. That's the six MCMs of the MS4 permit. It's covered by my QR code, but it says six MCMs up there. The first one is kind of reacting to public awareness. Hey, don't dump stuff outside. It's going to drain down to the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. Number two is let's try to get them involved. Let's adopt a county mile. Let's do a stream cleanup somewhere or whatever, right? Let's do these things. Number three is all the construction permit holders that are within our jurisdictional boundary. We're going to actually be the first people to visit that site. So if you're in the state of Michigan, and there's a state permit there, then even if I'm working in Ann Arbor, I won't get my first visit won't be from the state of Michigan. It's going to be from the city of Ann Arbor or the county there first, and then it will be the state if it escalates up to that level. And that's because it's part of their minimum control measures. The next one is dealing with all of the post-construction runoff from all the sites. And that means everything's built out, but we're just making sure that the sites are appropriately being managed to not discharge pollutants, that permanent detention ponds are functioning properly so they don't flood that site or neighboring sites or whatever. That's going to be under there. Then we also have IDDE, which is illicit discharge detection and elimination. That's going to fall under the MS4. And then we also have making sure that the MS4 operator themselves are keeping up with the wastewater treatment plants, the salt piles, maintaining their equipment, et cetera, making sure that all that's being done so that they're not discharging pollutants out of there. So those are the six minimum control measures. And so what you should recognize is effectively what's happened is these local little cities and counties, even down, like I said, to 10,000 people or more, are being asked to enforce the state or EPA permit. So they've been handed a sheriff deputy badge, right? So they are now part of the enforcement of the higher up organization, which they're underneath, whether that's the state or underneath the EPA. So that's kind of the interplay between these different permits here. Now, we're not going to focus on the others for the rest of this time. We'll focus on the industrial, but I want you to kind of understand how these different ones operate and how they play together. If you are, I've been mentioning whether you're under the state or the EPA, there are 3 states that have said, you know what, EPA, you're asking us to do this stuff, you can manage it. And that's Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Mexico. Also under the EPA, regardless of whatever governments there may be present there, would be Washington, D.C., military bases, international borders, Guam, Puerto Rico, Midway Islands, that kind of stuff. Those are all going to be under the EPA and Indian country land. All right. So even if you're in the state of Arizona and you have a state permit there, which you do, if you're working on Indian country land, building a new, apartment or casino or whatever it is you're doing, that would be under the EPA regulations and guidelines. So just keep that in mind as you're doing that kind of stuff. If you're, doing industrial activities, maybe you've got a scrap yard on some military base where you're taking all the old equipment or whatever, and you've got a scrap yard there, then you would be kicked under the EPA regardless of which state you're in. All right, so let's go into this idea that there are different sectors that are part of the multi-sector general permit, and it's based on your SIC code, or NAICS is what they're trying to go to now, which is North American Industrial Classification Codes. But anyway, the Standard Industrial Classification Code is a breakdown of this is what we're doing more or less on our site. And so you can see here, this is just an example from the actual permit itself. And it says, Sector C is China painting, enamels, platinum paint for burnt wood or leather work, paints for China painting, artist paints, and artist watercolors. And it's going to be underneath there. And it's going to be NAICS 339942. Now, where do we get these numbers? Well, first of all, when you begin the business, you're filing typically with your Secretary of State that this is the type of business that I'm going to be operating, right? You'll look down here, we're doing asphalt, felt, and coatings, which means we're doing like tar paper for roofing, roofing supply, or we're doing asphalt paving or asphalt blocks. Same kind of components, but slightly different. And so you can see there's a SIC code 2951 and 2952. That's because they're similar in ingredients, but different end results there. And so you have this idea that they're going to be under the same sector because they're the same potential kind of pollutants that might be present on the site, but they're going to be, delivering different items after they're done with manufacturing. So they've grouped like industries together into these sectors. Now, the sectors for the multi-sector general permit under the EPA are A, B, C, D, all the way to Z, and then AA, AB, AC, AD. So there's 30 in the federal EPA multi-sector general permit. Like California's industrial permit, they've broken it down even more. They've got more sectors than that, but that's up to them. They can choose to do that, right? They're a delegated state, so they can choose to do that. So when you're working on your site, I've actually had some sites where they have they have multiple different activities going on the same site. So I had one in San Antonio, and they were manufacturing. If you ever seen, like, for inside your house, those fake wood beams that you can put up, or the fake mantle places that look like stone or look like old wood, from an old barn or whatever. A lot of times those are not wood. A lot of times they just take some styrofoam, they shape it, and then they put some lathing over it, and then they put some a cement-based kind of stucco material on it, and they paint it. So that way it's much lighter weight than a big stone or big old barn log. And so they they actually had, on that facility, one side was dealing with the styrofoam, and so it actually ran out this side to the south side of the facility was the styrofoam side. And once those pieces were done being shaped and manufactured, they moved over to this side of the facility where they were being coated and painted. And so that water ran to the north. And so they actually had one facility with one permit, but they had two different SIC codes with two different outfalls, two different monitoring, sampling requirements, all that kind of stuff. But it was still under one permit authorization for that particular site. So that's why it's important for you to know what it is that you're dealing with. And when you're filling out your notice of intent, you can actually tell them, hey, we're primarily a flat glass, like just panes of glass. We're primarily a flat glass. Every once in a while, though, we will get into some glass containers. We'll put some vases together or whatever, right? And so you might have a primary SIC code and a secondary. And in my example, those would be both under subsector E3. And so those would both be covered with the same generic stuff. Now, if I'm doing hydraulic cement, which is under E3, and I'm also doing ceramic wall, floor, and tiles for whatever reason, those would be E3 and E1. I may have different requirements that are on those. So your permit authorization is going to be based on your SIC code here. All right. And as it's based on your SIC code, remember, those are grouped into similar sectors. There's 30 sectors in the federal one. And you can have more than one SIC code and more than one sector. You can have multiple SIC codes that are in the same sector, or different SIC codes that go to two different sectors for the same permit authorization. You just have to outline all of those items in your stormwater pollution prevention plan as you're working to get that completed. And then you can say, hey, we're all dealing with all asphalt paving mixtures and blocks. We're all 2951 SIC code subsector D1 on the entire site. Well, even if you have multiple places where the surface water is draining off your site, you can say those are going to be substantially similar outfalls. I'm just going to check this one over here, right? So you don't have to test every single outfall under the federal permit. Now, in my San Antonio example, when we had the styrofoam side and we had the cement stucco side, that one, we couldn't say substantially similar outfalls because they're two different SIC codes, two different sectors. So we had to sample a representative from each of the sides. So if you have multiple sectors or different SIC codes that are working on your site, that puts you into a different subsector, even if they're all under one sector, then that's fine. If you had, in my example, 2951 and 2952, those are substantially similar. But if I had a 2951 and a 2999, then I might have different requirements based on where. So I would have to kind of test and monitor for the potential pollutants from each of those different SIC codes. Now, if those are commingled together, then I would have to test for both at all of those locations to prove the average was not above the required benchmark or reporting levels. All right. And then there is something that's out there called NEC. Okay. NEC stands for No Exposure Certification. And so an example I have is they're a bentonite powdered clay with some polymers in it, additive that you would mix with a mixing oil. And as you're drilling a borehole for oil and gas exploration, you put this mixture inside there. It keeps the walls from collapsing. So that way, as you pull the pipe up to put new pipe on or put the new drill bit on or whatever, the walls of that borehole don't collapse. And so that's the mud they call that puts the pressure up against the walls to hold them open. If that stuff got exposed to water, that powder is useless. They can't sell it. So he went through great lengths to make sure that even the distribution, the loading, unloading dock, all that stuff was completely covered. You know, the entirety of the trucks and trailers would be underneath an awning out there, because if any water got onto those canvas bags that they were shipping it in, it would ruin his powder material. So we were able to file a no exposure certification saying, yes, we do have an industrial activity we're doing. We are under sector, it was E something, I can't remember what it was. We're under sector E, whatever that was. But we have zero exposure to rain or snow. We are not exposed to the elements at all. So we have a no exposure certification. You just have to keep, up with managing your site, make sure that you're self-inspecting. I had somebody who filed exposure, and then they ran out of room in their warehouse, and they started just stacking up finished products outside that were okay to be exposed to the rain. But the DEP agent who was doing the inspection said, those products are outside. They're not at their final location. That means you're exposing those to rain and snow on your site. And so the argument was, well, they're finished product. They just haven't been delivered to the customer yet. And the argument was, they're not in their final location. So you either need to put them undercover, or you need to keep your NEC, or you just need to file for full permit coverage, and then you can have them outside and just put some BMPs out there. So there is something called the NEC. You can't just decide, oh, I just don't want to do anything. I just want to have a no exposure and not have to deal with anything. You have to make sure that you actually meet those requirements, and it lists in the permit under your EPA or state, coverage, what those requirements are for the no exposure certification. All right, going into subsector E1. Remember, we talked about there's sectors, and then sometimes they have subsectors, and you can see that. So subsector E1, for example, you have to test for the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, on your site. It's just for you to have a record of what those look like on your site. It's a report only. You're just putting it into your binder. There's no, you put it on the report to the discharge monitoring report, but I'm just saying there's no like threshold value that's like, oh, I'm over. Like, it's not an over. It's just, is it present? Here's how much I had. And then like subsector E. So if I had a subsector E1 and a subsector E on my site, I might have two different requirements. If I'm under subsector E, I would also have to test for chemical oxygen demand. Again, it's just reported only. There's no level of how high or low it is. This is the EPA. Your state may have different, right? TSS, total suspended solids, how much is coming out of there? I'm just going to report it. There's no limit on what I can have. And pH, same thing there. Now, if you are underneath a different sector, you may have different requirements. And so here we see under the effluent limitations, this is just right out of the permit. You can see this is a printout of the permit here. And it's saying that if you're under E3, subsector E3, then when you have material storage piles at cement manufacturing facilities, a concrete batch plant, then there are requirements for you to report, and you have a limit that you have to meet. So the TSS is actually 50 milligrams per liter, a daily maximum. And so you can average it. You take one in the first half of the year, one in the second half of the year, you average that together. If it's above the 50 milligrams per liter, you need to implement additional control measures. If it's underneath that, then you're within the limits of the discharge from the site, and the pH should be between 6 and 9. I actually had a facility, a concrete batch plant, that they were testing their pH, and they said, "Hey, Brad, we got a problem. The pH is coming out at like 11.4." I said, "That's not good. That's not just outside of the limits. It's well outside of the limit, between 6 and 9 there." So we had to start adding muriatic acid to the concrete washout area where they were emptying out the residue from the trucks to offset that alkalinity that was coming out of the trucks there. So it's important for you to keep up with those items because it can affect wildlife downstream. So we need to make sure that we're monitoring this stuff, and that's why, because there are potential negative impacts to wildlife and plant life downstream. So you have to make sure that you're keeping up with those items, and the permit will tell you each different item that you're required to do. In subsector E1 here, and this is just an example, right? I just had to pick something, so I'm picking on subsector E right now. So subsector E1 says if you're doing clay product manufacturers, your total recoverable aluminum has to be 1,100 micrograms per liter or under. All right, so you got to test that twice a year, average it out, make sure it's under 100 micrograms. If you're under subsector E2, you're not worried about aluminum anymore. You're looking at total suspended solids, 100 milligrams per liter. And notice that 100 milligrams per liter is more than the benchmark, which was 50 milligrams per liter on the previous page. That was the effluent limit. So there may be different limits for different parts of the benchmarks and the effluent limits that are on the site. So this is why it's important for you to look at each particular item from each particular sector. And this is just sector E, right? We haven't even gone A through AD. We're just looking at sector E. So they have different components, and the EPA or your state has identified, we think these people in subsector E, there's a chance that what they're dealing with might have some aluminum that could possibly discharge from the site. So we just want to keep an eye on that. That's why this is in here. It's not just they're picking on somebody, right? They're actually, they've thought through, and it's here we are. The first multi-sector permit came out in 95. So here we are, effectively 30 years later. And they've really kind of looked at, hey, as we're taking samples and benchmarks and effluent sampling, we're looking at all this stuff. And now we can kind of hone in on, okay, there wasn't subsectors. It was just sector E for a while, but it was over the past 10 years that they started saying, okay, there's sector E, but some of these people were not worried about the aluminum. Some of them, this is a problem. So they put them into different subsector categories to match those evidenced results from previous permit cycles. All right. Now, some of the basic requirements from a stormwater pollution prevention plan and even an erosion and sediment control plan, all right, they're going to be the same kind of stuff that you're going to find in both. You have to have a stormwater pollution prevention plan prepared prior to filing your notice of intent. That's the same whether it's industrial or construction, all right? You have to understand the permitted activity that you're doing on the site. Hey, we're tearing up dirt, we're clearing off the land, we're building a new Starbucks or whatever it is. I have to understand the permitted activities. And the industrial side, you have to understand what it is that we're doing on the site, okay? A distribution center for dry cleaner chemicals is going to have vastly different potential pollutants than a facility that's dealing with, drywall production, right? I mean, just completely different. And so you have to understand the permitted activities for your site, what sector, maybe the subsector you're in, all that kind of stuff, right? You should have an ongoing list of the potential pollutants that are on your site. That's for construction too. Like, hey, we're going to do concrete. So concrete is a potential pollutant. It needs to be tested for TSS, heavy metals, pH, etc. My potential pollutants from my dry cleaner chemicals, right? Whatever. I'm making up numbers, but like making up names here, but like methylchlorobenzene or whatever. That's probably something that's super toxic, but well, dry cleaner chemicals are probably toxic too, but you get my point. Like you have to list, this is the chemicals, these are the two main items that we're using. We actually mix them in different quantities to treat different materials or whatever. I'm not a dry cleaner guy, but you get the point. Like we have to list out the potential pollutants here. The same as in construction, as in industrial permitting, you have non-stormwater discharges that are allowable, right? Like sprinkler systems for your landscape and your grass areas. You can have that in both. Water for dust control for construction sites or an industrial site. If you've got a rock yard or gravel yard out there and you got the forklift moving things around, you can put water down. That's a non-rainwater source of water that you can put on the ground that's allowed to discharge across your site. You also would include things like air compressor, air conditioner, and water cooling tower condensation that might be present there. Those are allowed to be discharged out onto the ground. Now, here's the caveat to all this stuff is they are allowed if they're not causing erosion, which is discharging sediment from your site, or coming in contact with the other potential pollutants and collecting those and discharging them off the site. So you'd want to make sure that you're keeping track of, where that water is flowing and what it's coming in contact with throughout the process. You want to understand what BMPs and control measures are needed on your site. Construction, majority of your site's dealing with sediment control, right? Because the site's torn up and we got water flowing across the site and it's moving dirt around, etc. On an industrial site, I have to understand silt fence is not going to help manage the dry cleaner chemicals, right? Dry cleaner chemicals are just going to go through there. They may even eat up that plastic. I don't know. It depends on what they are. So I have to make sure that whatever BMPs and control measures are needed on my site, they have to actually manage the potential pollutant that is going to be present on my site. And so I have to make sure that I'm analyzing, like with my concrete batch plant, that was an example I gave you. Hey, we've got too high of a pH. Okay. So my control measure there was, hey, for every truck that we wash out, we've got to add 15 gallons of muriatic acid to this settling basin where the concrete washout is pooling up over here, so it can neutralize that, and then it'll discharge as just runoff water that's between 6 and 9 pH. That's kind of what we had to back into that number. It was a test and go. It was like, okay, is it 5 gallons? Dump a 5-gallon bucket. Okay, we're still at 10.5 pH. Okay, that didn't work. 10 gallons per truck. All right, now we're still at, we're at 9.7 pH. All right, 15 gallons. All right, we're at 8.6. Okay, great. So let's just say 15 gallons per truck coming out of here. Boom, boom. So we kind of had to back into the number, but we had to match the control measure to that potential pollutant that was coming out of that site. So whatever that looks like for what you're working on is something you have to manage, and you don't know what you're working on until you have the full list of potential pollutant in front of you, right? So you may forget, oh yeah, I forgot we do use super duper heavy duty, silicone caulking over here on this particular facility. We're manufacturing in that. And if that thing leaks out of there, that's going to cause I forgot about that, right? So having an ongoing list that's always kept up to date with whatever you have on your site, that's going to be key. The other thing is the amount that you have on the site. Okay. So if I have a 5-gallon bucket, 5-gallon jug of gasoline or diesel on my site, my BMPs and control measures to manage that is going to be completely different than if I've got a 1,500-gallon tank out there. Okay. So you've got to think through not just what the potential pollutants are, but how much of it do I have enough BMP? Do I have enough spill kit in place to manage this discharge if this was to happen? All right. ESCP is erosion and sediment control plan. I'm just kind of connecting this idea because we have a lot more experience as an industry through the construction sites with erosion sediment control plan, SWIPs. I was connecting that with the SWIPs for the industrial. Good question, Hafiz. All right. And then the SWIP availability is the same for both. It has to be publicly available upon request. If they request a copy of it, you can redact any sort of proprietary information in there, but the rest of the stormwater pollution prevention has to be provided to them. Now, if you can't email it to them, you can make copies of it, and you have to make it at cost. So if it cost me $20 to make a copy of the stormwater pollution prevention plan, all the documents, then I would charge them $20 for that. That's reasonable cost. But you have to ask that they have to ask, and you have to provide. You're under permit requirement to provide that. Furthermore, if you don't provide that, they will file a Freedom of Information Act, and you'll be required to do that. That's under state and federal permit. So it's better just to keep up with your stormwater pollution prevention plan on your sites. Make sure that you're documenting changes. You can actually go in there and write. You can scratch there and say, hey, we're not using any benzoyl peroxide anymore. We're not using benzyl chlorine. I don't know, I'm making up words, but and so you can write that in there and just say, hey, we've got 55 gallons of it and it's used for this, this, and this, and the control measure, that we're having in place for this is putting it in a clamshell water resistant container to prevent rain or snow from ever touching that drum. Okay, great. Then now you've updated your SWIP. That's as difficult as it has to be. Okay. All right. Next slide. Whether it's for industrial or for construction, right? You're required to keep all the documents for a minimum of 3 years after the end of that general permit. So whenever I'm done with construction on my site, I have to keep all the documents, inspection reports, drawings, stormwater pollution prevention plan for 3 years. Then I can toss them into the burn pit while I have a cold one outside, right? When the industrial, like Heather's widgets, we talked about in the beginning, Heather's widgets, that's an ongoing, right? But remember, even though it's ongoing, you have those 5-year umbrellas that are opening and closing. So when this umbrella closes and we're now underneath that second umbrella, when that third year hits, we can get rid of all the documentation from that first umbrella. All right. So that includes notice of termination if she was to ever end her industrial production, or if you're on a construction site, of course, you're always going to file a notice of termination there. So the documentation that you must keep is the stormwater pollution prevention plan with all the updates, your notes, your additions, your amendments, all that stuff. A copy of your notice of intent. Here's what we're planning on. We're planning on making widgets, and these are, it's going to be made from chromium with titanium coating on them or what. This is where you put all the information in there, right? All of your inspections, and the inspection requirements are going to be different based on your sector, even maybe subsector, right? So if you're doing just metal fab work is going to be quarterly inspections. If you're doing concrete batch plant, that's monthly inspections, right? So you have to understand what your inspection frequency are. That's going to be identified in those sectors in the permit, and then you're required to keep those in that 3-year window before you can get rid of them. Any monitoring, like, hey, we looked at our outfalls. We noticed that there was no obvious discharge of anything here. We did a qualitative sample. We looked for color, clarity, odor, sheen, foam, floating solids, suspended solids, settled solids, and we tested that on a quarterly basis or whatever. So check up with your monitoring there. Any corrective actions or additional implementation measures, and those are going to be, we realized that BMP is just not going to work. It's utterly going to fail if this chemical comes in contact with that, whatever that thing is, it's just going to obliterate it. It's going to eat it up. All right. And so we need to put something different there. Instead of putting steel, it'll react with steel, but if we put aluminum instead, it won't react with the aluminum. Okay, well, we need to change it. That's a corrective action, not just maintaining your facility, but we've got to do a whole corrective action for this thing, right? You also get kicked into AIMS, additional implementation measures, if you sampled and you're supposed to be at 50 milligrams per liter of TSS, but you came back with 80, and you're like, oh man, what do we got going on here? Like, we're way above, right? We're not at 55, where it's like, okay, maybe the next half of the year we can sample again and we'll be at 40, and so we'll average, we'll be under 50, but like 80, it's like, oh crap, man, what are we going to do here? So you have to actually go in and figure out, where is this coming from? Where's the source, right? So put source control in place. Maybe we need to put some more vegetation down, or maybe we need to stabilize that area better, or maybe we need to change the treads on the forklift so it's not tearing up the ground as much when it's making turns, or whatever the case is. And then you will document that. And there's 3 different levels of AIMS under the federal permit. So if you want to take the QR code is taking you to the Qualified Industrial Stormwater Manager course, and it goes through those different levels in the course itself. Any of your lab results, like, hey, we had to test for the aluminum and we had to make sure it was under that level, or we had to test for PAHs. We had to report that. Here's the lab results that show what those were. You have to have those included for 3 years. And then if you get any notices of violation, all right, those are also required for you to keep up with on a regular, ongoing basis. All right, in review for this, we're not quite done, but in review from what I just talked about here, we did an introduction. We talked about the history, about how we got here from World War II, etc. I mentioned some of the basic SWIP requirements. The permit scope is based on your SIC code in your sector, right? And then some of the BMP and maintenance and operations, again, it depends on your potential pollutants, right? So we talked about understanding, am I dealing with dry cleaner chemicals or am I dealing with drywall, right? Those are completely different things, even though they both have the word dry in them, right? So we looked at record keeping, the 3-year window and all the items that are included in there. And then I'm just going to mention here our QISM real quick for you. You take the online course and you actually put together an action plan. The reason this is so special is because you actually put together an action plan of one of the 3 examples that we offer to you. And then you'll put that action plan together. You'll fill out what you're planning for your site as BMPs and control measures, how you're expecting them to function, and then you'll actually put together a site map for the site and say, this is where I'm going to put these control measures because I think the water is going to flow here and I want to make sure that we're not discharging these pollutants in this area, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll actually put together a sample site map for whatever you select. And then when it gets sent in, I'm the one who's grading those. And it's based on these items. This is the grading rubric, and it's basically, hey, you're got a solid grasp of this, the sector specific, but you really, really were struggling with the identification and justification of those BMPs. So whatever. So that's what this is. This is the grading rubric. So that being the case, I'm going to open this up. Anybody have any questions? I purposely left time here at the end because I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask questions. Put them in that little chat over there, and let's talk about that because I want to make sure that you feel like you have an understanding of what industrial stormwater. Some of you have been in it. Maybe oh man, I didn't realize that, or oh, I forgot about that, right? Or man, I had no idea. So those are the things that I'm hoping that you're getting out of this. So ask your questions down here. I know that we've got people from coast to coast that are here. You may have some experience that you may need some help with or something. So I'm going to answer those questions the best that I can. And shout out to Kitchi from the city of Houston. I'm based out of Houston as well. So shout out there. Any questions? I don't want to just keep us here if there's nobody going to ask questions. Type them in the chat box so I can try to answer what you got.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. If you would like to, you can go ahead and unmute as well. But while we're waiting for some questions to come in, thank you everybody for joining us this week for Stormwater Awareness Week. And thank you for joining us again for day 5. We still have 6 more workshops today to finish out the rest of Stormwater Awareness Week. If you miss any part of this workshop, or if you want to go back and review it, it has been recorded and it will be available within the next 24 to 48 hours. And it will be posted up on stormwaterawareness.org. It looks like there was a question that just came in.
Yeah, Diana says batch plants have to follow the effluent limitation guideline. I'm assuming you mean like a concrete batch plant or asphalt batch plant there. It is underneath the permit in the state that you're in, or if you're a non-delegated, if you're in New Mexico, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, then you're going to look under the EPA permit, but you're going to have to find out what are they asking for. So what my example today was the EPA permit, but if you're in the state of Washington, you may have different effluent limitation guidelines that you've got to follow. That may just be report only, or they might, you can't go above this level. Now, here's the deal. In reality, sometimes those effluent limits do go above the level, and that's not like, they're going to shut us down. It's just, all right, time out. Let's stop. Let's take a few moments. Let's sit down. Let's have a meeting. Let's figure out where this is coming. I'm gonna give you an example real quick. Robbie, I see your question. I'll get there in a second. We had a facility that was manufacturing, it was just angle iron, and it was for non-destructive testing of pipes, right? From oil and gas. Just look for those drill pipes to make sure that there was no cracks or fractures inside of them. And they had an X-ray machine that would kind of go across those. And then they just coated it with like bed liner material. That was it. Super simple facility, but it was underneath the SIC code. They put it into sector AA for metal fabrication. They were dealing with steel. I mean, steel angle iron. That's it. That's all they were dealing with. Their welding rods and their material. When we did the sampling, it came back that they were above the hazardous metal level of zinc on the site. And we were looking around thinking, where the heck is zinc? where's this coming from? So we had to sit down and try to figure out, okay, source control. Somebody got zinc out here we don't know about, what's going on? After doing some research, it took me like 2 months. After finally doing some research, I uncovered that the light blue paint on the exterior of this big metal warehouse building where they're doing the manufacturing, the paint was old enough, it was starting getting powdery. I don't know if you've ever seen that before. Sometimes this building, wipe your hand, you can see the paint color in your hand. The zinc oxide of that paint, which makes it opaque and light color, because its base is white, zinc oxide is white. And so that base was in that paint, and as it was deteriorating, it was washing off the site, and we were collecting that sample and was showing up in the sample. So again, you got to understand your potential pollutants. You have to understand, hey, what is my permit state on my effluent limit guidelines, et cetera. Good question. Ravi, do you develop stormwater management country like AP India? I don't personally do India, but I'm sure that if you are, first of all, I don't know if there is a federal or a state requirement in India for you to actually be enforced to do this. If you're doing it proactively, hey, good for you. But yeah, if depending on what you're doing, you can use any of the states or the EPA. If you don't have a permit that you have to follow there, then you can actually say, hey, I'm going to just pick the EPA and we're going to follow those guidelines as a self-monitoring practice, as a good practice for ourselves to help reduce our potential impact in the environment. So I'm not sure what the requirements are, Robbie.
Okay, thank you. I will look into it. If I have any questions, forward. I'll forward to you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. S115-180, which I'm just guessing that they probably gave that to you. I don't know what that means, but ask the question, is there any size limitation of facility in order to apply for an industrial general permit for a batch plant? Again, it's not, with construction, it's based on 5 acres and larger is a large site. You've got certain things you got to do. 1 to 5 acres is a small site. You got certain things you got to do. Under 1 acre is a micro site. You don't have to establish a SWIP or do any of that stuff. You just have to have your BMPs out there. On the industrial side, the multi-sector general permit side, it's not based on how big. It could be my garage. If I'm doing these industrial activities, I'm required to meet the permit guidelines. So if it's an old facility and it's only 0.25 acres, but there's potential to discharge these chemicals from that facility, not a residential, right? Residential people are not covered. But if I'm doing this and I'm selling these products and I'm manufacturing, or I'm dealing with those, I'm buying and selling this stuff, that's where it gets kicked into the industrial general permit. So there's no size limitation. It could be as small or as large. I have dealt with some mining facilities that are thousands and thousands of acres, across their property. And I have dealt with that. Probably the smallest one I've ever dealt with, let me think real quick. Probably the smallest one I ever dealt with was probably that one that had the styrofoam and the cement adobe stuff on there, the stucco stuff. That one was right at an acre size site. So, but yeah, I mean, the size doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter if you're brand new to the industry, hey, we just came out with this new thing we're doing over here. So we're kicked in a permit. No, if you've been doing it for 100 years, you've just been doing it without permit coverage. You're still required, even if it's old. There's no grandfathering in with the industrial stormwater permit. Good questions. Who else? We still got a few minutes here. I want to answer any questions you have. You can also, if you want to, my email is bflack@stormwaterone.com. You can find that right here. If you got any comments, questions, complaints, you can email me. First question's free. I want to thank you for coming today. And hopefully you learned something new about industrial stormwater permitting. If you're interested, we do have the qualified industrial stormwater manager. It's available on stormwaterone.com. And I think that's all I've got. I don't see any more questions popping up, Gabriella.
Awesome. So thank you, Brad, once again for coming out and presenting for us today. And thank you, everybody, again for coming out to Stormwater Awareness Week. We've been really happy to have you out here. It's been a really great week of education. If once again, if you missed any part of this workshop or would like to view it later, a recorded version will be available within the next 24 to 48 hours on stormwaterawareness.org. Thank you once again, Brad. We'd love to see you again next year.